Populio. Today, on the 23rd day of my action, I will talk about the three components of a population stabilization law and the four laws of civilization building. Thus, about the foundation of an open, permanent, effective, fair, and humane population control program that will help us save ourselves and our planet from a world divided into nearly 200 nation states, all competing for the resources of the one planet we inhabit. This is what we have turned the world into. And we're destroying this world. If we were to fulfill the aspirations of the nearly 200 nation states that we have carved the world into, we would need 5 of these planets. 5. Since we do not have 5 planets but only one, and since we cannot magically increase its resources, we must reduce our numbers and learn to live within Earth's finite resources. No amount of wishful thinking, praying, economizing, reusing, recycling, or restricting will change that. And no matter what political party or what ideology or what religion govern us, will change that. And no matter how much goodwill, kindness, compassion, free trade, technological advances, and scientific discoveries will change that. Neither God nor science will save us. We must save ourselves through our own individual and collective actions, and in the process save our civilizations. For we are but naked savages without it. Covert methods are inefficient and brutal and cause more problems than they solve. We have run out of time, since the global population already far exceeds Earth's regenerative capacity, and we will soon run out of vital natural resources as well. What we need is a permanent, humane, fair, and legal solution to the population problem. Keeping the trinity of life in perfect equilibrium can only be accomplished by legislating a population stabilization law and enforcing it globally. Such a law must be able to keep the 3 fine balances of people and resources, males and females, young and old. Hence, it must have 3 components: replacement level fertility, required assisted dying, and optimal population levels. As an apex species that rose above the natural order, we have been forced to maintain these fine balances, the divine equilibrium, the trinity of life, ourselves, and have done so through our spiritual and political systems, the convincing power of religion reinforced through dogmas, and the coercive power of government projected through laws. Both our religions and governments have fallen behind and have become useless relics that refuse to evolve and are as such obstacles to our survival. I'm here to give the church, to give you, Pope Leo, the last opportunity to grow up. And that is why I take the time to educate you and your cardinals. Let me start with replacement level fertility, meaning 2 children per woman. We no longer have the luxury of tolerating selfishness in youth or in old age. Intergenerational solidarity compels us all to do our part in a commensurate and age-specific way. We come into this world because our parents have fulfilled their reproductive duty and joy of conceiving children. As members of our species, we have 2 overarching duties: to ensure the perpetuation of the species and the continuation and evolution of our civilization. The first brings us into the world, and the second sustains us in this world. Everything else is secondary. So let's get our priorities straight. Replacement level fertility ensures that the population neither grows nor decreases and is therefore stable. A stable population ensures also that each generation replaces itself, and the perpetuation of the species is therefore assured. If fewer than 2.1 children are born to every woman, then the population decreases and eventually becomes extinct. If more than 2.1 children are born to every woman, then the population keeps growing until it outgrows the land's resources, which leads to war, and eventually outgrows the planet's resources, which leads to environmental collapse. We are on the brink of this latter stage. Since 1945, and in some countries earlier, fertility is limited by chronically poisoning the population with endocrine disruptors through the basic elements of life. This has caused the epidemic of chronic or non-communicable diseases that prematurely kill 90% of us and has rendered a third of us sterile and all of us subfertile. If governments continue to use this method of subverting fertility, soon not one of the planet's 8.2 billion people will be able to reproduce, and our species will become extinct. Governments and the international system are currently trying to replace covert chemical methods of sterilization with coercive biological methods of sterilization, hence mandatory or quasi-mandatory vaccines. But the result will be the same: the collapse of fertility and ultimately the extinction of our species. In their foolhardy arrogance, governments believe they can regulate human fertility artificially in perpetuity by turning it on and off like a water tap, without permanently damaging our ability to reproduce. The scientific data, however, shows otherwise. It shows that since 1973, sperm count has decreased by half, and that since 2000, the decrease has accelerated from 1.16% annual loss to 2.64%. At this rate, all men, let me repeat that, all men will be incapable of reproduction within a decade. Clearly, covert chemical and biological methods of sterilization can no longer be used and must be immediately discontinued. Just as clearly, mankind cannot return to its natural reproductive rate of 8 to 12 children per woman. The only solution that permanently stabilizes the population without damaging human health is to legislate replacement level fertility and provide people with free or low-priced contraceptives on demand. Required assisted dying, RAD for short. Required assisted dying at age 75 ensures that mankind survives the last stage of the demographic transition, the euphemism used to describe the last stage of the population stabilization program that, due to overpopulation, has become a population reduction program, or a DEPA program. During this stage, the old outnumber the young, and unless their number is reduced, society will collapse socially, demographically, fiscally, and economically. Having interfered with the people's reproductive system since 1950, we now have the infamous inverted population pyramids throughout the developed world. That is to say, population structures that are characterized by too many elderly and too few young to support the elderly in old age. When pensions were instituted at the turn of the 20th century, at least 20, if not 30 workers supported a single pensioner. As governments impaired fertility, every generation born was smaller than the previous one, and now 2 workers support 1 pensioner, which is economically unsustainable, as it drains the finances of the state for what is essentially a non-productive cost, and it also drains the finances of the young, as they are forced to pay too large a portion of their wages in taxes to support the old, while they themselves are left with too little to raise families and buy themselves a house in which to raise their children. Not only are we now in a situation where 2 workers have to support a pensioner, but by 2050, a worker will have to support nearly 2 pensioners, which is impossible. Society will collapse long before then. In addition, not only do we now have too few young workers forced to support too many old pensioners, the old are also living longer than ever. So long, in fact, that we have added another generation. Whereas in the past, the working age population only had to worry about supporting their parents in old age, now they also have to support their grandparents. Now, unlike in the past, there are 4 generations living at the same time: children, parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. So the parents, who are the only productive members of society, have to support not 2 children and grandparents, but 3 dependent generations: children, grandparents, and great-grandparents. Never in history was this the case. Let me say that again. Never in history was this the case. Since this is an unsustainable situation of limited duration, mandatory assisted suicide at age 75, it is absolutely necessary until the old age dependency ratio falls below 20%. It is currently around 40%, and by 2050 it will reach 60%. I say of limited duration since the two largest generations, the baby boomers, born 1946 to 1964, and Generation X, born 1965 to 1979, will have either retired or died by 2050, and we will no longer have to contend with inverted population pyramids. The mandatory assisted suicide will remain in place past 2050, but only to limit lifespan to the level that makes biological and economic sense, which is a maximum of 85 years of age. Otherwise, the resources of the state and of families will be drained to extend life irrationally long at irrationally high cost that would deprive families of much needed physical and emotional resources to raise children, the state of much needed financial resources to invest in development, and society of much needed human resources. Absent that, we will end up with 5 generations living side by side: children, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents, since everyone would live to the ripe old age of 120. Henceforth, no one will die in vain, for even in death we can be of service to mankind. Let us all recognize that, honor every sacrifice, and meet our Maker proudly and joyfully. Optimal population levels, the last component of a global population stabilization law, means that each nation will have to reduce its population to a number it can sustain on its own resources without being a burden on the other nations and their resources, and without polluting or denuding the land of resources that nature cannot regenerate, which would make life impossible for future generations. According to the Overshoot Index, there are currently 114 out of 187 countries that are in population overshoot, some more than others. In other words, that are a burden on other nations because they cannot sustain all their citizens based only on the resources of the landmass they occupy, and need to import a great deal of resources to make ends meet. It should be noted that the Overshoot Index has calculated every country's sustainability based on the current standard of living and not on the highest standard of living to which all individuals and nations aspire. This being the case, the greater the standard of living a nation aspires to, the fewer people it will be able to support sustainably in perpetuity. What is now an optimal population for any given country may therefore not be optimal, but suboptimal tomorrow if the standard of living goes up. What is an optimal population will therefore have to be adjusted by every generation if the people of a nation aspire to a greater standard of living than their parents had. This being the case, 114 nations must reduce their populations until they reach the optimal population level that allows them to live sustainably. And the remaining 73 nations that are not yet in overshoot will have to stabilize their population to avoid going in overshoot. This can all be done gradually and painlessly if there is a global population stabilization law, as that would allow governments to adjust births and deaths with the aid of the population as needed from decade to decade until the desired optimal number is reached. An optimal population level will provide an optimal standard of living to every human being, as there will be no need to compete for scarce resources or to hoard them for rainy days. So far, our civilization has tried to stay ahead of population growth. Now we're trying to establish equilibrium between humanity and nature. And once we accomplish this, our task will be to adjust our numbers down as our per capita consumption grows along with our standard of living. I have expressed this completed and yet to be completed evolution in 4 laws of civilization building, which I have stuck on the wall here above my head. And they state, 1, right here, that you have to limit the quantity of life to improve the quality, and you must do it selectively to aid and accelerate the process of natural selection and improve the intelligence and genetic makeup of the stock. Number 2, that you have to slow down population growth to remain within the technical ability of society to produce food and build infrastructure, and you have to do it by any means necessary, because failing to do it will have only negative consequences. Law number 3, that once you get close to the planet's carrying capacity, you have to stabilize the population in perpetuity and stabilize it at a level that is sustainable for any given planet, so the planet's life support systems are not damaged, in which case intelligent life would unintelligently sow the seed of its own destruction. And number 4, that once a state of harmony is reached between civilization and nature, all subsequent progress depends on society's ability to reduce the number of people in direct but inverse proportion with the per capita increase in the consumption of resources, and that this reduction has to be accomplished with everyone's free and conscious collaboration. In other words, the more technologically advanced our civilization becomes, the fewer people can be accommodated on planet Earth, and all people must contribute to mankind's reduction in numbers to enable mankind's ascension in level of civilization. Every human being on the planet must memorize these laws, since they will guide our actions for as long as we exist. Just as the need to control population growth will continue for as long as we exist. We are now stuck between the second and third law, somewhere here. We have managed to slow down population growth, and now we must manage to stabilize it at a level that is sustainable. This we must accomplish by the end of this century. And if we succeed, then we will have to continue to reduce our numbers to enable mankind's ascension in level of civilization, which is what the fourth law of civilization building states. All intelligent life in the universe is guided by these 4 laws of civilization building. But here on Monkey Planet, the criminals, cretins, and cowards who govern us have yet to even acknowledge me, let alone understand the laws or the significance of these laws. Don't be a criminal, a cretin, and a coward, Pope Leo. Break the mold. Evolve.